Hello, nerds.
Oh, hello, nerds.
It's been a long time, Steve. How have you been, sir?
Oh, very well. Busy being a dad, being politically active up here in beautiful New Hampshire, and of course, watching all things political, regionally and nationally. It's a fascinating time.
Yeah. Speaking of New Hampshire, have you heard any talk about changing up the primary calendar, or what's the latest on that?
Yeah, so people forget that this isn't run in a governmental way; it's run by the parties,
Mm-hmm.
um, and that and that means the rules of each state really matter and they're quirky. So the Republicans have already locked in New Hampshire, and for that matter, Iowa in the traditional order for
Okay.
2024. Now, if Trump ends up running again and ends up not getting a significant primary, which is very possible,
Mm.
then that it'll be kind of academic on their side because they likely would not have a terribly contentious primary. But they have committed to the traditional order. Democrats have at the national level have been really pushing hard to change it up for a lot of reasons, and I think some of it was Iowa's debacle in 2020, where I'm not sure we know who the winner of the Democratic primary is yet. Um, you know, and then in New Hampshire, we had a great election, really well run, as we always do up here. But I think a lot of folks nationally see the lack of diversity, certainly racial
Mm.
diversity, as
Mm.
something that does not reflect the current base of the party nationally. Of course, I push back hard on that because um, we have a tradition of getting candidates who are not well known and are not terribly well funded a chance.
Yeah.
And many times they have succeeded. I mean, whether it's Gary Hart in 1984, the comeback kid Bill Clinton in 92. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, yeah. And then Bernie in 2016. I mean, if
Mm.
Bernie doesn't win New Hampshire, he's out of the race the next day. And he wins it by 21 points. And, so we have this rich history of this on both sides of the aisle. Here's the thing people don't realize: we're going to go first. And that may sound arrogant, but, but we have a law in New Hampshire that
Uh-huh.
is decades old. And it literally says the Secretary of State of New Hampshire unilaterally shall have our primary no less than 7 days before any similar event. We shall. So you see this over my lifetime. Delaware tried to do it early.
Mm.
Michigan tried to do it early. They're like, yeah, we'll do it in January. And we're like, screw you. We'll do it in December of the year before. And we can plan it on very short notice. I mean, this is what we're good at.
Yeah.
So we're going to be first. Like, that's not the question. The question is, are we going to do this the easy way or the hard way?
Yeah. Now, if the Republicans start in Iowa, for sure,
Yep.
that was a state where I think Trump actually, that was the first time he said that the election was rigged, because I think he lost to Cruz and he said that there was foul play and it's contested. We should have known that that would be a pattern.
Tom, it is so legit what you just said. Uh, when people tell you who they are, you should believe them.
Yeah.
And your memory is spot on. Ted Cruz won that election. I believe Rubio actually finished second,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
Trump finished a disappointing third. The polls in that case overstated his support, it appears.
Yeah.
And yeah, and Cruz. Well, I mean, Cruz and Rubio were very close to taking control of that election, that primary. And you're right. He started saying all the things you just said. He said it was rigged. I mean, all the language that we are hearing today,
Yeah.
he was saying then. I mean, the problem with Donald Trump is not that he's inconsistent, right? They're like, he used to be pro-choice. He used to give money to Pelosi, blah, blah, blah. That's true. The problem is the stuff that he's been consistent about.
Mm-hmm.
In my opinion, he's been consistently xenophobic. He's been consistently disrespectful to processes. He disrespects, he lies about his finances, and all this stuff's coming home to roost now. The question is, will Republican primary voters overlook all of that because they believe that the party is a Trump-centric party, and that Trump, for all his problems, they see as sort of on the right direction on a handful of issues that matter most, like nominating the right judges.
Yeah. Do you think he's going to be the 2024 nominee? Trump will be, you think?
If you're
Is
betting
that a
money,
foregone conclusion, or?
I mean, if you're betting money, the most likely outcome is going to be a Trump-Biden rematch. Trump is doing everything that one would if they were planning on running again.
Yeah.
And of course, he is the overwhelming favorite. You know, some folks will look at DeSantis and say,
Right.
well, I don't know, maybe DeSantis could compete. Virtually every poll, including many in Florida, show Trump comfortably ahead of DeSantis. I mean, to me, there's little doubt that if his health holds up, Trump will run again. And of course, he looks at it as maybe one of the best ways to avoid legal jeopardy. And whether that's accurate or not, I'm not an attorney, but you know, he has every incentive to run again, and I think he will.
That's it seems like health will be the main blocker for both of them if they don't become the nominee.
I think you're right. It's certainly not going to be, there's no evidence it's going to be an internal challenge, political challenge. You know, and look, President Biden continues to say privately and publicly, look, I'm the Democrat that has the best chance of beating Trump if he runs again. And I think he says with some merit that Trump getting elected in 24 is an existential threat to a number of institutions and processes in our country. And so if you believe that job number one in 2020 was beating Donald Trump, and it is obvious that that's what Democratic primary voters eventually landed on. It wasn't your 7-point plan on economics or COVID or healthcare. It was, who do I think has the best chance of beating Donald Trump? In 2024, I think what we're finding is it's kind of a variation of the same question. I think Democratic primary voters, once we get through the midterm, are basically going to say, okay, what do we have to do to make sure that we keep Donald Trump out of the White House? It's kind of remarkable that this political environment nationally remains more about Donald Trump than it does about Joe Biden.
Yeah. Well, I think so many on the left are terrified of another Trump presidency, and Trump has not quietly gone away. Like, he's at rallies, he's holding on to documents and refusing to honor requests for, you know, his former employer's confidential materials. Like, he's not quietly going into the sunset. I mean,
and this is Mitch McConnell's nightmare. I mean, it's not just that that the 2022 midterms are becoming less of a referendum, which would be generally bad for Democrats because that's the history of the first midterm of a new president. It's becoming a choice between Biden and Democrats and Trump and the party that has become part and parcel the same thing, synonymous. The Republican Party is the Trump party. So it's not just that Trump won't get out of the way and allow the natural rhythm of first term midterms to take effect, which would almost certainly be major issues for Democrats. And now it's not. It's an even Steven environment. It's that Trump also had an outsized influence in who the nominees were in important races for the U.S. Senate, Congress, and governor. And this is how you get Herschel Walker. The lieutenant governor of Georgia is a guy by the name of Jeff Duncan, who would be called a conservative by any historical measure. But because he thinks he thinks the Georgia election was legitimate in 2020, and because he doesn't like Trump, he's considered a Republican in name only, a rhino, which, you know, he's Kemp's lieutenant governor. He said, I believe yesterday, quite publicly, look, hey, Republicans, you want to know why we got this Herschel Walker problem when honestly we should be ahead by 5 points for this seat?
Right.
It's because Trump basically influenced this primary so completely
Mm.
that Trump became infatuated with Walker because he's infatuated with celebrity, um, and sports, frankly. And
Mm.
remember, Donald Trump was the owner of the New Jersey Generals USFL team
Oh yeah, I
back in
remember.
the 80s. Herschel Walker and Doug Flutie.
Yeah.
I mean, like this is personal for Trump, and Trump values celebrity. The reason why Donald Trump, one of the reasons he's in such trouble right now in terms of the overvaluing of assets. This is what the New York Attorney
Mm-hmm.
General, one of the things she's going after right now, is if you look at it historically, Trump in valuing his assets for the purpose of being able to leverage it for loans, right?
Mm-hmm.
Having equity, he would regularly increase the value of hard assets, of tangible assets like buildings, by hundreds of millions of dollars because they had his name on it. So he
Mm.
valued his name as this literally, the name itself is a multi-billion-dollar additive asset.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's and he that's how he thinks about celebrity. So when he sees Herschel Walker, he or Dr. Oz,
Mm-hmm.
he goes, "That's a famous person. They're going to win." And then it's
Mm-hmm.
like, well, the problem is everything else.
Yeah. Yeah.
And both of those are candidates that honestly, Republicans should be in the driver's seat right now in both of those races. And I think Democrats are going to win both of them. And it's because of Donald Trump.
Yeah. He's never had a great eye for talent. When you think about the revolving door administration he had, and I mean, I also noticed he truthed or the equivalent of tweet on his own media platform. He said he called he said that Mitch McConnell had a death wish and that his China loving wife
Oh,
Coco Chow. I
oh,
mean, that was his own Secretary of Transportation when he said he hired the best people.
you can't have it both ways. You could try. I mean, look, he values loyalty, personal loyalty, one way loyalty over everything else. And, I think he looked at McConnell and McConnell's spouse and many others in leadership as long as you think I'm awesome,
Hmm.
then I'm not going to attack you. Notice it's not as long as you think I'm awesome, I think you're awesome. That would be a two-way
Right,
transactional, but two-way transaction
right.
relationship. That's not how this works. It's basically a one-way transactional relationship, and that's how most people. I mean, he has very few friends. He has very few people that trust him, and consequently, there are very few people that he trusts because eventually the relationships go sideways.
Hmm.
And in politics, look, McConnell, who obviously I don't agree with on policy, is really good at what he does. Um, the way he was able to get through those Supreme Court nominations and freeze the Merrick Garland nomination in 2016 under Obama,
Hmm.
I think it's awful, but it was masterful the way he did it. And Trump, the last person Trump should be criticizing are McConnell and Chow. I mean, these two folks are not the problem for as far it should not be seen as the problem as far as Trump is concerned.
Yeah, he's a real piece of work, that guy. Um, I also found, just for giggles, because in case people were wondering, like, hey, Trump, he only talked about fraud after the
Hmm.
2020 elections.
Uh,
In Feb 16, he said, based on the fraud committed by Senator Ted Cruz during the Iowa caucus, either a new election should take place or the results should be nullified. Cruz did not win Iowa, he stole it. We finished second. I want to tell you something. Okay, so then that's basically Cruz saying that he's honored that he won.
yes.
So yeah, it's basically that, to stop the steal all over. I guess the precursor to it. Well, if we say that DeSantis doesn't have enough support to challenge Trump, and that as long as Trump remains conscious, he'll probably get the nomination.
Yeah.
What about Biden? Is there any challenge from Newsom, or do we think like Buttigieg might throw his hat in the ring? Like, how competitive do we think the Democratic primary? Like, what kind of action are we going to see in New Hampshire for the
Well,
Democratic primary?
first, I feel very confident that if President Biden decides to run again, there will be no meaningful primary. I think part of that is the nature of the culture of the party right now, the structure of the party. Let's face it, he's not a former president; he's a current president. That makes a
Mm-hmm.
difference. Of course, we have had a few examples in my lifetime. In 1980, when Ted Kennedy took on Jimmy Carter, in 1992, when Pat Buchanan took on George H.W. Bush. Those are two pretty prominent examples. And indeed, what we find is that when, in virtually every case, when the incumbent president runs for reelection and is challenged in a meaningful way
Mm-hmm.
by within the party, uh, the president gets renominated and they end up losing in November. Now, there's a chicken and egg element to it. Is the reason they get challenged because they're weak and vulnerable to begin with? So all it's
Mm-hmm.
doing is sort of identifying somebody who already would be the underdog in the reelection, or does the process itself of challenging a sitting president have the effect of weakening them considerably? It makes them look weaker. It makes voters look at them and go, man, they must not be doing a good job. Their own party doesn't want them back.
Mm-hmm.
And it means you're using resources. It means you're kind of typically lurching to the edges of your own party to secure, instead of talking to the broad center of the
Mm-hmm.
electorate. There's a lot of things that are not good. I have no doubt that Biden would not have to worry about any of it. And part of it is Biden's had a very good, say, 6 months here, generally speaking. A lot of legislation that appeared to be dead
Mm-hmm.
has become law. There are elements in the economy that are defying expectations in a good way. I think inflation is stubborn, and the Fed is poised to raise interest rates by another 3/4 of a point before the end of the year. In fact, I think that's very likely. OPEC is restricting the supply they're willing to put out in the near term, and that's going to have an impact on gas prices. Unfortunately, the day after OPEC announced that they're going to knock it down by about 2 million barrels a day starting soon, you saw gas prices nationally go up by more than a dime a gallon the next day. And that's
Mm-hmm.
weeks before you would actually see the impact in terms
Right.
of the spigot. So, I mean, this is a real thing. And we know that gas price sensitivity does have a relationship to voting behavior. This worm could turn a few more times in the next month.
Mm. Yeah, he's less popular than I thought he would be, given some of the legislative kind of wins that he got. But I also agree that the gas prices, inflation, and concerns over recession, like we would be blaming Trump if he were in the White House during this time. So it kind of has to go both ways. I I guess you're saying uh, if as long as Joe says he wants to run for renomination, like nobody's gonna be able. It's just like the DeSantis thing. Like nobody's gonna be able to
No one's
challenge.
going to do it. No one could compete.
Mm.
And not for nothing, some of the people who would be best positioned if they wanted to go for it, I don't think
Hmm.
any of them would have a strong challenge to Biden. But they have their own long-term ambitions and know
Right.
that
They just wait it
it would.
out.
Yeah, oh yeah. So I think Buttigieg, clearly Harris is on the ticket.
Hmm.
Newsom, there. I mean, the Democrats. I have to say, compared to, I don't know. I'm going to pick a time out of the air. A decade ago, the 2010 wipeout election for Democrats. Not only did it cause Democrats to just lose massive numbers in the legislature, in the House and Senate, governors, everything. It also had the effect of knocking our bench down for half a generation. There were a
Mm-hmm.
lot of candidates that if they had survived the 2010 election,
Mm.
and then 2014 was a pretty nasty one, the second midterm for Obama, that knocked our bench out. Not unlike how 2018 hurt the Republican bench, the first midterm of Trump. So we had to kind of rebuild, almost like a sports team that has to kind of early stages of rebuilding.
Mm-hmm.
You have to build a farm system before they come to the big leagues. And I do think that the Democratic Party now has done a good job of reinvigorating that bench. So if big if Biden didn't run again, and I think he will, but if he did not, I think you would see a vigorous and potentially wide-ranging
Mm-hmm.
Democratic primary field. And I'm not sure I would have said that a couple of years ago. I would have said you got Harris and you got Buttigieg, and then everybody else is going to have a tough time getting in the game.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's much more wide open than that, and you could see a field of double digits, maybe not as big as 2020, but you could see double digits easily. And there's a lot of good candidates. Jared Polis in Colorado, making a name for himself. He's a unique and interesting figure. He appears that he's going to cruise to re-election this year in his governor's race. We could go down the list. There's multiple people that ran in 2020 that I think would be very interested in doing it again. It's a big field, but I think Biden will run again. And look, if Biden takes on Trump, I think he'd be favored to win again.
I just remember you and I talking about the transitional administration, the
I
notion of,
know.
and so a lot. I mean, I'm a registered Democrat, and I voted for Biden with the understanding that, okay, like we're going to have not Trump, and then we'll kind of go back to a more kind of normal process, and that Biden was, basically the not Trump candidate for me. And in some ways, he's done better than I anticipated. In other ways, like he's done not as well. Like I don't feel like he inspires confidence when he talks about what he's doing, like in his public appearances. And so I feel like it would be great for him to declare victory after his first term, and he'll go down in history as, infrastructure bill, veterans health, capping Medicare prescription. Like that's great. He did a lot of great stuff. But then kind of pass the baton to the next generation. But it doesn't sound like he's going to do that.
I think
Yeah.
if he thinks Trump is going to run again, he believes in his core that he is the person who can beat Trump. In fact, Biden, according to reputable reports from inside the administration, he will say that he believes he's the only Democrat
Yeah.
that can beat Trump. And whether one agrees or disagrees with that, if he believes it,
Yeah.
then that's all that really matters in terms of the strict question of will he run again. The one thing that I think people forget, because he won and he's president, Joe Biden, I'm 48 years old. Joe Biden has been, for everybody, 60 years old and younger.
Mm-hmm.
We have not known a time in our American lifetime where Joe Biden has not been engaged in the national political conversation in one role or another. He was elected actually before the legal age to be a U.S. senator. He turned, I guess, 30 during the period, and that's when the tragedy involving his wife and his daughter occurred with the car crash around Christmas time in '72, which changed his life forever, obviously. And I think has injected a level of empathy
Mm-hmm.
inherent in him
Mm-hmm.
that remains one of his greatest strengths as a civic person. But he's run for president several times, and they've not gone well. I mean, he dropped out in '87 before the first election. He obviously struggled mightily in '07, '08.
Mm-hmm.
He was struggling in Iowa and New Hampshire, right? I mean, he did not
Yeah.
do well here. Um,
Yeah.
I think that everybody agrees that if he had not won the South Carolina primary in 2020, he would have dropped out. And then he did better in Nevada, which was the third one in between all of this. But I mean, it didn't look like somebody who was about to run the table. It took a lot of things going exactly right. So look, Joe Biden's weaknesses going back to the '70s, it's
Mm-hmm.
not like they went away.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just that they did not get in the way this time around of him being able to be the nominee. Yeah, I mean, if you look at these numbers, I mean, you'll have to scroll to the next page to see Joe Biden. You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
and
Seriously.
in full disclosure, and our friend Andrew, it is
And
true
our friend Andrew. Yeah, we'll have
that
to
was a very
take
difficult
view
night.
all there we go. Now we get it. I mean, that was not a great showing for Andrew either, for sure. But
Uh,
the fact that our current sitting president couldn't get into the top 3 in Iowa, like, it just reminds us how he was not a very strong. He was basically the most palatable person that we thought could beat Trump, and I think that's what we ended up with.
yeah, and look, I think his strengths did match up well
Mm-hmm.
against some of Trump's vulnerabilities. His personal story is an excellent match against Donald Trump's persona.
Yes.
Uh,
Yes.
I would argue one of Trump's greatest weaknesses as an elected official, and I'm not trying to be a jerk, there's a fair amount to pick from. But I think one of the weakest, and during COVID, it just was so painfully obvious, was his complete lack of ability to show empathy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I remember my mother-in-law passed away from COVID in August of 2020. This was well before the
Mm.
vaccines came out.
Yeah. Yeah.
My father-in-law, they are both deceased now. They lived in Missouri, where my wife grew up, outside of Kansas City, and wonderful people. My mother-in-law was a saint, and she, unfortunately, my father-in-law got COVID. One of the few
Mm-hmm.
times he left the house, they both were really compromised physically
Mm.
and at risk. And then she got it. He survived it narrowly, but she did not. And it impacts my kids. It impacts obviously my wife and myself. I mean, it just kills you. And
Mm-hmm.
when President Biden first got in office in January of 21, which was, of course, only a few weeks after the January 6th insurrection,
Yeah.
he and Mrs. Biden went, I believe there was a makeshift kind of like a memorial for all of the victims of COVID um, in Washington. It was near the Washington Monument, if my memory is correct. They put it in the lawn.
Mm.
Uh, and he spoke, and he's like, let me just say, for all those who have lost a loved one due to COVID, how deeply sorry I am for you. And my wife and I started tearing up watching that. And she's like, I didn't realize until that moment that was the first time that my
Mm.
president had said that out loud. Like and he's like, look, I have experienced loss. I know how painful it is. And I want you to know that I'm thinking of you and I'm deeply sorry for your losses. And that's like that went so far. And I mean, there's a lot of things Joe Biden isn't awesome at. He's a
Mm-hmm.
malapropism machine. He has been his entire life. It is what it is. He's overcome an amazing overcoming of stuttering and all of
Mm-hmm.
these things. But man, is he good at that? And we really needed that. And it was a great contrast to Trump. And I think things like that were actually instrumental in getting him over the hump and what was a kind of scary, narrow victory in 2020.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's easy to forget that. I mean, there's been over 1 million American deaths due to COVID, and that'll go down in history as one of the most traumatic experiences for the country from a public health point of view. And I agree with you that, I think Trump's insecurity led him to not want to acknowledge that this is a big deal. I remember he said, mark my words, nobody's going to talk about COVID the day after the election. It's all just a, hoax or whatever. And,
Yeah.
a lot of people probably believed him and probably exposed themselves to risks that they should not have, and may have, I'm just statistically, some probably died when they didn't need to because their president told them that this is just like a, kind of a democratic, show of opposition to the Trump movement.
I completely agree. I mean, I remind my Democratic friends all the time that just because you, let's say, Democratic activists, don't know a lot of people who supported Donald Trump, doesn't mean they don't exist. And it doesn't mean they don't exist in large numbers in wide swaths of the country. We must remind ourselves that small numbers of votes moving in Arizona, Georgia, the blue wall states, small numbers change who the president is. And this isn't like some conspiracy theory, just the math of it. He almost won again. And he almost won despite stepping on himself every 5 seconds. If Donald Trump remember when Andrew was doing the CNN commentating regularly, he was I think it was September of the election year, 2020. I remember he was going on CNN every day, begging the Congress to pass some muscular form of at least a short-term universal income version. And he goes, listen, Donald Trump, he's like, he would look into the camera. I remember he was talking to Wolf Blitzer. And he's like, I'm telling, and he criticized Nancy Pelosi, and Pelosi and Yang kind of went back and forth. It was a weird moment. But he looked in the camera and he's like, Donald Trump, I oppose you for re-election. But as an American, I'm telling you, if you will just like recognize what's going on here and get financial help directly to the people and recognize their pain and the tragedy, you will be reelected. And I really believe that if Donald Trump had simply looked in the camera and said, this is really bad, and we're going to do everything we can, and I'm urging you to take this seriously, I think he would have won.
Yeah.
And fewer people would have died.
Yep. That's an interesting ethical dilemma. He would have won. And probably fewer people would have died during the pre-vaccine period, but then we would have had him for another 4 years. I wonder what Putin would have done with Ukraine with Trump in office.
It's so hard to say. Yeah. And I mean, I'll say this. I think that Joe Biden has handled the the Russian invasion generally very well. His knowledge and history with NATO allies has been a real net positive, I think, during this process. He's been generally a calming influence. He has generally avoided bombastic language or quick decision. I don't really like that he used the term Armageddon this week to describe how close we were to nuclear war. I think that's probably not helpful. I think that unwittingly helps Putin a little bit in the short term, in the sense that it makes Putin seem more serious. When, let's face it, he's in a corner right now. He's calling up hundreds of thousands of civilians to fight who don't want to and won't be well trained, and they won't be well armed. And now he's throwing around talk about these tactical nuclear weapons because he's got nothing else.
Yeah, he's backed in a corner. I was just having lunch with my wife yesterday, and we were reflecting on how great powers seem to constantly need to learn this lesson over and over. Like, no matter how much resource superiority you think you have, if you go into someone else's country and they don't want you there, it's really hard to quote unquote win and hold that territory. And it's clearly the Ukrainians do not want the Russians there. I know the official results of the referendum was like 99% voted to go to Russia, but I don't that one I do think was rigged.
Yeah, I think that one. That one was rigged. Yes, good point. Yeah, occasionally the elections I guess are rigged.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think you're right. We have so many data points, not just the last 100 years, but throughout mankind.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, if people uh, resist, then what you end up, and the funny thing is, I mean, shouldn't Russia know this? Like,
Really.
haven't
Yeah.
they been on the other side of this?
That's right. That's right.
Well, I mean, to me, they're one of the best examples in the last 100 plus years of like they were able to use sheer manpower, just sheer
Hmm.
number. I mean, I tell folks, you don't have to be a history major. Have you ever played Axis and Allies? Like, I mean, it's amazing when you do the tabletop versions of the
Hmm.
of war, and you see that if you have an opponent who has massive numbers of people that they are willing to throw in front
Yeah.
of perhaps a superior armed force, if people want to resist badly enough, eventually you can wear down your opponent. And I think that one of the long-term things that's coming out of this is when this is resolved, and as the prime minister of, I believe, of Finland, um, and forgive me, I'm blanking on her name. She was in the news recently because she was actually out socializing. You might recall, and they got on video, and they're like, a leader of a country should not be having this much fun on a Saturday evening, to like a
Hmm.
wedding reception or something. And she's like, buzz off. Very popular in the country. She was asked in English at the in Prague, where they're having a NATO-related
Hmm.
event. How does the Russia-Ukraine conflict end? And without any flinching, she looks in the camera and she goes, "When Russia leaves."
Mm.
And then she turns around and she smiles back like, "I don't have to say anymore. We're not compromising here." And
Mm.
and Ukraine is working so hard and resisting so impressively.
Hmm.
Um, I kind of feel like the rest of us that are rooting for them have an
Hmm.
obligation to not undercut them by sort of suggesting that there's some what presumably would be a land ceding as a compromise. Ukraine doesn't want to do that, so why would the powers around them try to undercut them by suggesting that that is something that the West would find acceptable? Ukraine clearly does not find that acceptable. So I really appreciate her comment because it's very simple. Russia started this. Russia can end this.
Yeah. It would be a big blow to Putin's domestic kind of support, or like it would be a very embarrassing thing for him to have to. What would he say? Like, oh, we've successfully denazified Ukraine and now our mission has been accomplished and we're coming back
I mean,
after they officially annexed like 15% of the territory, right?
the part of the challenge is there is some evidence that rank and file Russians are becoming more aware over time. I mean, this is what happens in the age of the internet in a way that didn't during much of the Cold War, for example, the entirety of the Cold War, where it is much more difficult to keep information away from your citizens, from your residents, for an extended period. I don't look. We know Putin thought this would be a blitzkrieg, that
Hmm.
this would be a shock and awe, that they would basically take it over. Not unlike some of the like what they did in Hungary
Hmm.
in the 50s, and so like, and of course now we're going on what 6+ months, 7 months, and you cannot keep information capped
Hmm.
indefinitely. And so there is diminished support. And now, when you're asking hundreds of thousands of people, "Hey, I'm going to need your son or your husband or your dad to fight," you can't mask that anymore. It got real for that household,
Yeah.
and I think that's really taken a toll. And obviously, there are more sanctions that can be imposed, and I think over time that may be. It's interesting. OPEC cutting down supply will probably in the near term help Russia a little bit by increasing the
Hmm.
value of their natural resources, at least for some period of time. And what we really need to do is figure out how to help Europe get through what could be a very painful winter in terms of fuel. And anything, I think that's going to be one of the short-term priorities. And if we can get to the other side of that, I think that will even further strengthen the resolve of the West in this conflict.
Steve, I always love having you on the show, and I know that it is your weekend as well, and you have family. So I want to be respectful of your time. I just wanted to ask one last thing, maybe two.
Yeah, sure.
One is like, what are you up to, or when are you thinking of running again for something? And then the
I mean,
second is, what's your take on what Yang's up to?
yeah. So I'm not running for anything right now, but I do have a political action committee that I formed a couple of years ago during the pandemic when everybody was stuck in their house.
Mm-hmm.
And I had run for governor in 18. Um, and it had not ended successfully. I got about 35% of the primary vote. As folks remind me, even the other night when I was at an event in Nashua, I ran during the Year of the Woman, and I am not a good match for that. And let's face it, I kind of half jokingly say to people, it's hard to be upset about that, and certainly in a personal way, when one can make the argument that the first couple hundred years of the country were
Yeah.
the centuries of the straight white guy.
Yeah.
So it's like if you're trying to be humble and keep it real, you can't really be upset about that because of just look at history. So that was a difficult year to run, and obviously I supported my opponent who won that primary, but then lost to Chris Sununu, who has become somewhat of a national figure, a unique national figure as a Republican who's been successful electorally, and has a mixed history relationship with Donald Trump. We'll see what happens there in the future. But I started a political action committee. It's called Move the Goalpost, because basically I feel like certainly in New Hampshire and to some extent nationally, as a lifelong Democrat, that the goalposts have been set going back to the Reagan Revolution, starting really in the mid 70s when Reagan became a national figure, about what we're allowed to talk about and not talk about in terms of taxes, education, the environment, healthcare. And too often, I find a lot of my Democratic friends, again, unwittingly, allow the debate to be held within the goalposts that have been largely in the same place for 50 years. And I named it in 2020. The Dobbs decision came down 2 years after I formed the Political Action Committee. To me, that's an even better example. We're no better off if you're pro-choice as I am. We're no better off in that regard in a lot of ways than we were 50 years ago. And a lot of my Democratic friends said, well, look, don't push it. When I was running for governor, I was advocating strongly to codify abortion rights into state law because I was worried that there could be a day when what happened would happen. And then it would be kind of Wild West in the 50 states. Well, here we are. So, we got to play offense. If you're not playing offense, you're going to be playing defense. Something Joe Biden said many years ago, of all people. He said, nobody is ever standing still in politics. You're either moving forward or you're moving backward, but you are moving. You are never in the same place. And that means that if you're not trying to move forward, if you're not playing offense, somebody's going to try to walk over you politically and on policy. So I've expanded that greatly this cycle, and I focus on purple districts in New Hampshire, down ballot. So state House, state Senate. We have 400 House members in New Hampshire, so there are many campaigns from which to pick. Have raised tens of thousands of bucks in low-dollar donations in state, and have been putting out kind of 538-ish data-driven approaches to targeting candidates. I travel the state. I speak at places. I help those candidates, give them money. And I'm very excited about it. I think we can actually take back the majority in the New Hampshire House and maybe the New Hampshire Senate. So if folks want to check that out, and if you like to nerd it up, and if you're still watching this, I think you're going to be into this. It's Move the Goalposts, plural, nh.com. Move the Goalposts, nh.com. And you can sign up for the emails. They typically do ask for money at some point in them. but they are not, click the button or Trump gets it. Like it's not like those kind of Pelosi scared now give money.
Mhm.
It's not like that. They're very informational, and I think the viewers will enjoy it given the nature of the audience. So that's keeping me very busy. We'll look at the future. I've become an empty nester in the last month and a half, and I'm enjoying time being really politically active on an easier schedule, and suddenly doing things like going to lunch with my wife Sandy and not having to worry if they have a kids menu. How about that?
Oh God, I totally, yeah. I've got one that just started high school and another one that's in 7th grade, and we're starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel.
And
In
by the
terms,
way,
yeah.
Tom, one of the things that I I just tell everybody whose kids are younger. So your kids leave the house and they're doing their thing,
Mhm.
and then you go out to dinner uh, on a Wednesday evening
Mm.
because you don't feel like making something, and you're like, you know what, we can do that. We can do that. The novelty will
Mhm.
wear off of that. And we sit down, and then invariably at some point we're like, I wonder what the kids are doing right now. Oh, I miss the kids. We end up talking about them
Right.
because we miss them.
Yes. Well, that's nice. I like that combination. You get to talk about them. But then when you come home, like you don't have to chase them around and ask them to go to bed or turn off the Wi-Fi or
Oh, no question. Like at night when we're getting ready for bed, you don't need that 10 minutes of picking up the house again. Like, how did this
Yes.
happen? How did this just
Exactly.
happen?
Yeah.
Groceries are a lot easier, like in terms of what you buy. The
Yeah.
grocery bill goes down. Um, you're not playing Uber driver. I mean, there's the logistical part that
Yes.
you'd be lying if you said you missed all the logistics. What you miss is the relationship, the constant nature. Um, just you miss your kids. So we're going to see a bunch of them as we enter the holiday season, and but all this is to say, now I can use my political action committee and really get out there and be very aggressive in these final 4 or 5 weeks. And I've met a ton of awesome new candidates, and it is a wonderful feeling to be on the giving end of time and support and money
Yes.
rather than to be a candidate where you feel like so often all you're doing is asking for
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's part of the job. So anyway, as a transition, and then in terms of Andrew, look, I mean, I'll be totally honest. I wish Andrew had stayed in the Democratic Party for many reasons. Part
Mhm.
of it is that I think he has so much talent and has the ability, and really, I think the Democratic Party remains in a transition phase. The country remains in a political transition phase. Um, Suburban voters are flocking to the Democratic Party, who were once the base of the Reagan era Republican Party.
Mhm.
But non-white voters are quickly leaving the Democratic Party. Non-college educated, blue-collar white voters have evacuated the Democratic Party. There is this constant churn, the moving of the tectonic plates, under your feet
Mhm.
of politics. It never ends. And so the coalitions are changing. And I think that Andrew, with all of his skills and uniqueness, maintains the ability to help the directing of those tectonic plates, the building of coalitions, the engagement of voters, so many good things. And I think the Democratic Party is actually, there's so much opportunity to be in the middle of that action. Still love them, and I will tell them you're welcome back in. Come on in, and obviously in the meantime, I obviously appreciate some of the democracy improvements that
Mhm.
he is working on. I think ranked choice voting, ending gerrymandering, campaign finance reform, term limits. There's so many things that we can do that would improve the democratic process, and we got to do that because this doesn't just happen, right? Like it's democracy is activity.
Do you think New Hampshire would ever implement open primaries and top 5 ranked choice in the general, or
I think it's
because
possible.
it seems like an independent place, like you
Yeah,
all. Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that we do really well is we have same-day voter registration, which I think is
Mm-hmm.
critically important.
Mm.
And we have open primaries in the sense that an undeclared voter, our version of an independent, can walk in on primary day and select the ballot they want. So that's not quite as good as the ranked choice where you just, or a jungle primary,
Mm-hmm.
but it's a pretty good next best thing. And we have a long history of doing it really well. It's part of the reason why we should maintain first in the nation, because what it does is it has the effect of bringing the plurality of voters that are not aligned with either party, and it gives them a voice, not just in the general election after the choices have been made for them. It allows them to help make the choice. This is how John McCain in 2000 against Governor George W. Bush actually lost by a point among Republicans, registered Republicans who pulled the Republican ballot that day in 2000. But he won undeclared voters who pulled a Republican ballot that day by
Mm.
something like 2-1. And it allowed him to win that election by almost 20 points.
Yeah.
And of course, that without that election, he drops out the next day. He almost got the nomination in 2000. And of course, 8 years later, he was the nominee. And it all started in New Hampshire. And that happened because undeclared voters could say, hey, you know what? I want kind of a reform Republican candidate. In too many states, that option is not available. And that's too bad.
My dream would be New Hampshire remains first in the nation and is also the first to host an open presidential primary with ranked choice voting. Woo!
That would be, as somebody who's, worked campaigns and
Yeah.
is kind of back in my operative roots a little bit with my work with my PAC and all that kind of thing. The level of excitement, the level of unpredictability,
Mm-hmm.
and I know Andrew has talked about this countless times. When you do the ranked choice, it so discourages going negative, and
Yes.
it encourages relationship building, like he did with Garcia, right? Coming down the stretch in the
Mm-hmm.
mayoral
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
race. Like I think voters want to see a lot more of that. Like, tell me why you're awesome. And then can you say something good? Like, if you don't win, who's the next best candidate?
Mm-hmm.
What a constructive, positive vibe that will get people back into the process. We know what negative campaigning does. Negative campaigning will stop as soon as it is not effective. But it is effective because we give people binary choices.
Yes. Yes.
And we know that the negative mailers and negative TV ads have the effect of bringing down the approval ratings and of bringing down enthusiasm with the other party's base for voting. So the entire strategy is to say, look, he says I suck. Well, he sucks worse. Vote for me. What a terrible message. But
Yeah.
it's what works. We got to change that.
Yeah, yeah, and I want to apologize to people in the chat that I promised Steve I would let him go at 30 minutes, and we're at 53. And they're like, "Hey, we have more questions," but
I'll tell you what. If you want to take, I should be gone in a couple minutes. But if you got a quick question or two, I'm glad to take it. If you see something that you think might be interesting.
Okay, so let's see. I think there was a question, and folks, put it back in the chat if you have a burning question. There was something about Biden's age, but I think we've talked about that we acknowledge it. He never had a fastball in some ways. So what we're seeing now isn't that different, really.
It's not like he was Obama. You know what I mean? Yeah, that's just not who he was. And I think that there is some conflating between what people think as some kind of cognitive decline due to age with kind of base skills that have or have not existed going back to his Senate days. He and Republicans generally, I think, really go after any mistake he makes as obviously cognitive decline. And I'm kind of like, I'm not a medical professional. By all accounts, he is super engaged.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, kind of the way I was amazed that Bernie Sanders could keep up the campaign
Oh
schedule that
yeah.
he did.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Bernie looks as engaged mentally and physically as ever. I can't stand Trump, but Trump is a workhorse on this stuff. That guy he'll keep going.
Oh, I tried to do a reaction video to one of his rallies, and I could not persist because it was like 3 hours of him
Yeah,
talking, and I was like, "What is this guy? What kind of caffeine is he drinking before
I
these
mean,
shows?" It's amazing. Yeah.
Pelosi is like 80, and
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, I'll tell you what, stuff gets through the House, and the Democrats barely have the majority. They have no room to lose people. And we never talk about the House as the problem in getting legislation through. It's the Senate. So whatever one thinks of Speaker Pelosi, she remains effective at her job into her early 80s. Now, do I think we need generational change? As a Gen Xer, is it increasingly frustrating that we see so few faces from the Gen X generation
Mhm.
stepping into public life? Yeah, and what I worry about is if the boomers and even the silent generation, right? Biden's technically silent generation. If silent generation and boomers just kind of keep sticking with this, we're now at a point where the millennial generation is now old enough that, like Buttigieg, that now they're like, oh, I guess it's our turn. And as a
Yeah.
38-year-old, I'm like, whoa, whoa,
What
whoa, whoa, we
happened?
got 10 years here.
We got skipped.
What's
I
that?
hear you.
So anyway,
Yeah.
that's what in terms of age, I worry more about. It's time for Gen X to be able to get more in the game, and we are a small generation relative to the two surrounding us. We're the
Mhm.
smallest in relative terms in American history, and I think that if we're not careful, Gen X could get skipped by and large at the national and certainly at the presidential level. Andrew
Mhm.
Yang was the last Gen X candidate in the race.
Mm. Oh, that's yeah, that makes it yeah, that's an interesting factoid there. And yeah, I totally agree. I feel like if we go straight to the millennials, you're going to lose a lot of the experience and kind of perspective that the X provides. Let's do some rapid fire. I got three
Okay,
final questions. I feel like we talk about this one every time you're on. What happened in the 2020 New Hampshire primary? I thought we had a good chance. So, what's your quick one sentence summary of why Yang, did not perform well in New Hampshire?
I very much disagreed with the strategy that was employed in the fall of 19 to redeploy most resources to Iowa. The
Mm,
belief of many in the campaign was that if you didn't do well in Iowa, it would make you dead man walking for any candidate going
mm,
forward. I disagreed with that, and there was a lot of evidence for that. And then in Iowa, if you don't get 15% in a caucus location, you effectively get zero. And I had known
mm,
from working on other presidential campaigns in the past that Andrew was not well positioned to get to
mm-hmm,
15. And that means that even though he probably had 7, 8, 9% support, it was going to
mm-hmm.
look like zero because if you don't get to 15, you get zero in a
Yeah.
precinct. And when that happened, he really was dead man walking. I think that there was a scenario where we could have said, you know what, Iowa, we're not playing like McCain did. McCain, because
Mm-hmm,
he didn't support the corn subsidy there, the
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
ethanol. So like he said, I'm not even playing. So he didn't do well, but he reset the expectations of that. Of course he wouldn't do well. And he spent all his time in New Hampshire. He put it on the line there with a better electoral system with undeclared voters being able to vote, which was, I think, Andrew's strength. And he was, dead man walking by the time he got to New Hampshire. And I think it didn't have to be that way.
Yeah. The other extreme would have been like Giuliani waiting till Florida to engage his primary campaign. So that was probably too late. But
I think
yeah,
it's too late.
yeah, putting all of your chips on New Hampshire, a little bit of an onside kick there. Like hard to get that 15%, and then if it doesn't work, you're kind of all your money's gone. And maybe New Hampshire, I actually agree. I think New Hampshire would have been more favorable to
There's no
Yang, given that.
question it
Yeah,
was the best match in the early states
yeah.
for an unconventional candidate, whether it's Hart in 84 and, Buchanan in 92 and both times for McCain in 2000, 2008. I mean, we have lots of evidence of that. And and one of the challenges I think within the campaign is that they looked at the cost of television in the Boston TV market and to some extent the Manchester TV market, and said we won't be able to put the kind of TV on that we can in more targeted ways in certain Iowa TV markets. To which I'm kind of like, the good news is New Hampshire geographically is so small. It's a small state, but 75% of the population lives in the southeast corner of the state. So it's not just a small state, it's a really small concentration of it, kind of Concord to Nashua, over to the seacoast, and then kind of back up, which means that you can run a field campaign in a way that you can't do in Iowa, certainly Nevada, even South Carolina. Anyway, that's my explanation for it.
All right, two more.
Yep.
Could the abortion debacle mobilize Dems in the midterms? Is probably what he's talking about.
It absolutely is and will. There's the reason why Republicans generally are advantaged in how do I put this, in a neutral political environment. The Republican base nationally is smaller than the Democratic base, but it is an extremely passionate and locked in base. So their turnout percentage of their base is almost always higher than the Democratic base. Democrats win in high turnout elections when everybody comes out. Democrats lose when you have a lower turnout kind of juice. So what we saw is for this midterm, before the Dobbs decision, Republicans were between 65, 67, 68% said that they were certain or very likely to vote. That's a very high percentage. Democrats were struggling to get to 60% on that same question. And that delta of 7 to 10 points is the ball game. That's the ball game.
Yeah.
Dobbs comes out. Even now, months after, it is at parity. Most polls show Republicans remain engaged, right? Like they're still at 67-ish. But now Democrats are at 67 as well. And the Democrats generally have a wider base of less engaged voters. So if they're percentage-wise equally engaged, that's a larger number because they have a larger denominator. And I think that's the reason why you have what should be a red wave first midterm problem for Biden and the Democrats that is being largely neutralized by the passion largely coming from the Dobbs decision, as well as fear of Trump, right? Trump staying in the game is not helping. You put, and then you add to that Herschel Walker, J.D. Vance, Dr. Oz, and you go down the line. There's just a Kerry Lake running for, and Blake Masters in Arizona.
Yeah, it's like a Trump squad.
These are not attractive general election candidates. So it's Dobbs decision, Trump hanging around, scary and unattractive, a high-profile Republican nominee, Don Bolduc here in New Hampshire, incredibly unattractive Senate candidate, has basically taken what should be an extremely competitive Senate race and has turned into a 10-point advantage for Maggie Hassan. You don't take this for granted. These are just not good Republican candidates. So, yes, I think it will be a big turnout. Dobbs is a big part of the reason why, and I think that portends relatively good things for Democrats in November.
Last question: chances of independent candidate in 24?
Zero chance. Depending on who the independent candidate would be, and by the way, I would throw in Libertarian, which is not independent. That's a party. But it's the same dynamic I would describe. For better or worse, the country remains structured for binary choices, certainly at the presidential level. There's some evidence when you get down ballot, partially because the electoral, the districts are smaller, and because individual stories or candidates can sometimes transcend these dynamics I'm describing. So like in Utah, Emmett McMullen is in a real dogfight for the Senate seat with Mike Lee. The reason why he could win, and by the way, he got like 15, 20% in 2016 for president in the Hillary Donald Trump election. That was the guy who ran in 16 as an independent. He's still running as an independent, but the Democrats effectively said, vote for Evan.
Yeah.
because even though he's more conservative than we would like, he's way better than Mike Lee. And when you consolidate that, here's the thing: even that remains a binary choice. It's just one of the two parties basically said, "Here, you take this," and he's an independent. Even that's not a great example because it remains a binary choice. This kind of goes back to what I was saying about our friend Andrew earlier. Is I think that the way the country is structured, I still believe generally the best way to make change happen in a real meaningful way is within the party structures rather than outside of it, certainly electorally. And like I give Bernie a lot of credit. For example, Bernie Sanders did not seem like somebody on paper who was going to be able to impact the dialogue of
Mm-hmm.
policy and politics in our country. He was a 70-something-year-old guy who seemed kind of quirky from a quirky state. The whole shtick. He wasn't even a
Yeah.
registered Democrat. He was at 5% of the polls against Hillary at the beginning. He changed the conversation in a generational way on a number of the minimum wage,
Mm-hmm.
healthcare, immigration, how you campaign, how you raise
Mm-hmm.
money in campaigns,
Mm-hmm.
who can run. He changed it, and he did it even though he's independent. Eventually, he realized the only way I'm going to make this kind of change happen is within the Democratic Party. So he never actually became a Democrat.
Yeah. Yeah.
He worked within it. I think that's the move. And I think that any independent, libertarian, non-D or R candidate that runs for president will have the effect of pulling votes away from one of the two. And which one just depends on the candidate and their platform.
Well, Steve, if you ever decide to push for New Hampshire to be the first state to host an open presidential primary with RCV, let me know. I will pull out my checkbook and try and support that effort because I think it would be so transformational and people will be like, "Wow, look how they're campaigning differently or look how this person performed really well when they would never have been given a shot in, the traditional approach." And it seems like a very New Hampshire way to do things, very
Well, in
independent.
Maine,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm less
Yes.
than 10 miles from Maine. Maine is showing us um, how things like this could be done.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think we're learning a lot. I mean, look, regardless of whether one liked or disliked the outcome, I think that the Susan Collins Sarah Gideon race for
Mhm.
Senate, which was so big, Gideon was up that entire time,
Mhm.
but Collins, I think, had a base of support and did not have a lot of people that disliked her, and I think that's really
Right.
important. And so I think there were a lot of people that pretty clearly were not comfortable with Gideon, who they saw as a little too liberal for Maine, and wanted to kind of ding Collins a little bit for her support of Kavanaugh and that kind of thing right before the election. But they had to come up with a way to communicate that. Right? There's a nuance to that, and I do think that probably the ranked choice system gave voters a chance to communicate nuance in a way that the traditional binary choice just doesn't really let you do.
Yeah. Totally agree. Well, Steve, have a wonderful weekend. Thank you
Awesome
so
to see
much
you,
for coming
Tom.
back in, man. It's
So good to
always
see you.
yeah, I hope we can meet up in person one of these days. It's always a pleasure chatting with you and I feel like we could talk for a while.
Well, and we'll do it again. We'll do it again.
All right, with that we'll say goodbye, nerds.
Goodbye, nerds.
See ya. All right, Steve Marchand, man, that's a great dude. Hey, before I forget, here's the gong. I'm going to give you a preemptive gong for everyone watching this right now who has done the kindness of liking and sharing. Now, if you don't like and share and you got the preemptive gong, the karma is kind of neutral. But if you like and share after getting the preemptive gong, like you'll have a great rest of the weekend. Guaranteed. All right. So, how are we still able to keep this channel going? It's because of channel members, and I want to thank them. So let me pull up the list of channel members. And if you're watching this on YouTube, just go ahead and, oh God, YouTube is asking me to do verification. Click the join link, and you can join for like $1.99 a month at the entry level. Oh, two-factor auth. Secure, man. This thing's locked down. All right, here we go. Who are our members? Well, our biggest member is Soldier One. He is our senior vice president, and he is in, or was in, the chat. And he's awesome, and we appreciate his support. And he has been a supporter for a very long time. So 30 months, Soldier One. So thank you, Soldier One. So let's see. And yes, Vaughn, there will be a shout out to you. I noticed that you always put that in the chat. Shout out to me. I love it. All right. So, but first, we got to start with Soldier One. And then we'll go to the VP level. After Soldier One, we have Kristen Slevin and Bike. And then we go to the hardcore level. Gene, David, DK, Jekalego, Kirsch, Mr. History, Mona, Vaughn. Shout out to Vaughn. Yang, Robert, Dean, Stat, Galessa, J. Perrin, AH, Dana, Jason, Parth, Daniel, and Mickey. And I want to thank StreamYard for supporting the streaming costs. And then verified nerds, we have Lisa, Albert, Brandon, Orez, Sophia, Doris, Emerald, Ben, Rasta, James, Emma, Ira, Elizabeth, Shoni, Dr. Jameson, William, Karen, Ardent, Zemery, Mai, Brittany, Warren, Wana, Lucky Kevin, Nell, Mercy Ann, Toby, Jeremy, David, Nicholas, Mike, Aurora, Lisa, N, and Zig PC. And who are our oldest and youngest nerds? Okay. Overall, our oldest nerds are Lisa, Jean, Kristen, Albert, Brandon, Erez, and David. And our youngest nerds, less than a month old, are N. Carter, Zig PC, Aurora Borealis, and Lisa Mans. So thanks, everybody, for becoming a member. And thanks to all of you who liked and shared, because nerd content does not share itself, sadly. I will see you guys next time. Goodbye, nerds. Oh, and if you're wondering why I haven't profiled OTP candidates, I'm going to wait for the forward party to announce their initial endorsements, and then I'm going to add them all to Of the People. And then what we can do is do approval voting to see which of the forward party candidates are kind of the most interesting to the audience. So that'll be on ofthepeople.us. So there's candidates on there already, but they're not the forward party endorsed ones. They're Republicans and Democrats. Also super cool. Well, since I mentioned it, why don't we just talk about who's trending on Of the People right now based on most recent approval voting, which you can do right now if you want to vote for and support whoever you see on there. You just click on their profile and click approve, and then it boosts them to the top. And right now, who's the top one? Marcus Flowers running against Marjorie Taylor Greene in Georgia. David Kim in LA area. Lan Hee Chen running for statewide. He's a Republican running for California controller. And Gary Voter and John Fetterman. So those are some of the top candidates. And then if you're like, hey, David Kim should be number one, then you just click on him. And then you click this approve button, log in, and then he'll, based on number of recent votes, he can move up in the ranking. So ofthepeople.us. And since I'm talking about Of the People, I should thank our Patreon supporters, because they're the ones that pay for all the costs of the People web hosting and software licensing. So let me see if I can pull that up. Oh no, I don't have. Ay, ay, ay. See if it's working. Continue with Google. Was it this one? Maybe I'll pull it up on my phone because my browser refreshed, so all my cookies are gone. Patreon. Yes, I can. I think I can pull up my patrons on my phones. Unless, no, the mobile app. View page. Pledges. No, I can't pull up the list. All right, let me try one more time to sign in. Okay, does that work? You can see how stubborn I am. Most people would have stopped the live stream by now, and yet I persist. Oh, where the hell is it? Rats. I may have to give up, guys. I got one more login attempt. Maybe this one. You would think I would have pulled this up earlier. Hmm. All right, folks. I will thank our OTP people next time. Yes, Soldier One's like, you could do it next time. Good idea, Soldier One. But thanks to all the Patreon supporters because that OTP project is, I think it's going to be super interesting once the November elections are done because I find OTP has the most interesting stuff pre-primary. And then we're trying to launch our Ask Me Anything feature for all the candidates. So check it out at ofthepeople.us. Goodbye, nerds. And don't forget to like, share.